On behalf of PSBA, welcome. I want to just thank a couple of folks, certainly our friends from Centennial, Mark Miller, who's been active with PSBA for many years, for helping to organize this, for putting the space together. Just a wonderful place to have this kind of meeting. So Mark, Dave, thank you so much. We appreciate your generosity. We have, on behalf of PSBA, a couple of board members here tonight. Maura Burry's here, and Art Levinowitz is here as well. So welcome to a couple of our governing board members. And finally, a thanks to our staff from PSBA, our government affairs team, really jumped in both feet and put this together. John Callahan and his whole team. And I'm going to turn it over to Megan, who's going to make, I think, introductions. And Megan really was point on this for us. So again, thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you for your support of PSBA. And we're looking forward to a great discussion.
Thanks, Nathan. It's hot? Okay. So I'm Megan McDonough. I run point on all of our federal issues for PSBA, and you're all here tonight because we care about that one specific issue, special education funding, and I want to thank the panel members for coming and spending time with us this evening, and if we could just give a brief introduction of ourselves, starting with Mark here.
Okay. As Nathan said, I've been active with PSBA for several years, including as a board member and officer. I'm going to tell you a little bit about each of the panelists and then also let them introduce themselves. But Dr. David Boyle is our superintendent here. Congressman Fitzpatrick is our congressman in Bucks County. But Congressman Boyle is also our congressman because we share a lot with Montgomery County, and we believe in Bucksmont being the area, and Centennial happens to be right in the center of all the districts in Bucks and Montgomery County. And the main reason they're both here tonight, aside from their caring for children and education, the bill we're here to talk about tonight, House Resolution 1878, was introduced on March the 26th of this year, and Congressman Fitzpatrick and Congressman Boyle were among two of the original 12 co-sponsors, meaning they did it right then, the minute it was introduced, along with Congressman Glenn Thompson from western side of the state. So 3 of the original 12 co-sponsors were here in Pennsylvania. Today there are 113 co-sponsors. 6 are from Pennsylvania and 5 are from this area. We like to think that's not an accident, and by the end of this evening, you'll understand why. So, Dr. Ball? Oh, and Tina Valletta from Montgomery County Intermediate. I couldn't see her after Congressman Boyle there, but I only know Tina for about 12 years. So,
thank you, Mr. Miller. As Mark said, I'm the proud superintendent here in Centennial, but this is an issue that's near and dear to all educators' hearts. But on a personal level, I started out as a special education teacher and then wound up a father of a special education youngster. So it's near and dear, it's a personal cause, but it's also something we live every single day here in the school district and across the Commonwealth. So I want to thank you, gentlemen, for your support and leadership on this legislation.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting. Does that work? All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for hosting us tonight. This really should be an informative, educational discussion for myself and my friend Brendan. In addition to both being huge proponents of public education, we're both Irish, and I'm way more Irish than Brendan. And if he tells you otherwise, he's lying. I'm kidding. He's actually first generation. I'm second. And we just got back from a trip from Ireland together. But we're both very, very big proponents of kids. And part of that is education. Part of it is gun safety. There's a lot of different aspects of being proponents of young people and the future of our country. And I think we would all agree that among that subset of young people, of children, the most important that need our help are the special needs community. I have a special needs brother, someone who I love dearly, who I will be the primary caretaker of very, very shortly. And, you know, it's something that has always inspired me, that people that enter the profession of public education, complete heroes who are not giving nearly the respect and the appreciation that they deserve, but particularly people that deal with the special needs community, because that is tough work. It's really challenging. It's physically, psychologically, and emotionally exhausting to do it, but it's so important. It's so important because these are the people that need us most. And what Brendan and I, the least that we can do is do our part from the legislative standpoint to provide that funding at the level that that is needed, if not beyond. It's supposed to be 40%. It's dipped down to 14%, which is unacceptable, and we're trying to get that back up. That's what the bill that me and Brendan are supporting. But we will do everything we can. But really what we want to do is hear from the people that eat, sleep, and breathe these issues every single day, which is each and every one of you, to give us your personal experiences. So we appreciate you inviting us. Thanks.
Well, thank you, and thanks, Brian, and to all the panelists, and to Mark for the invitation. I'm Brendan Boyle, member of Congress, now my 5th year. For 4 years, represented Montgomery County and Philadelphia. The maps then changed and took me out of Montgomery County, but I live all of about 15 minutes from here, and my wife was for a decade a kindergarten teacher in Lower Moreland School District. And as someone who lives nearby, who is in the Bucksmont or Philmont, depending on which avenue I'm on, but as someone who is from this area, I sometimes joke to my buddy Brian, I'm almost a constituent of his, because I'm about a block outside his district. Obviously, this is an area I care a great deal about. When I was representing Montgomery County in Congress, even before that, representing a state rep district that was part far northeast Philadelphia, part Montgomery County and Abington Township, getting involved in these sorts of issues was very important to me. So now that the district lines may have changed for a cycle or two, I'm not suddenly going to change my priorities and my knowledge base on certain issues. So when I received the invitation, was eager to accept. Also nice to see a number of faces who I haven't seen maybe for a little while, who are active, either coming to Harrisburg or Washington to be active on this and other education related issues. Those sorts of relationships are important, and I encourage you, if you've never done one of those legislative trips, I obviously know from firsthand experience some of you have, but for those of you who haven't, I strongly encourage you to do so, because if you think about it, what Brian does, what I do, what any member of a legislative body does, at our best, we need as much breadth as possible. Because one moment, speaking about one part of an overall education issue, the next moment we might be in Ireland talking about Brexit. The next moment we might be talking about Ukraine. The next moment after that, we're talking about an energy issue and having to vote on these things, and having to ideally construct sensible public policy. So while we also attempt to gain as much depth as possible, that's really where you come in. The folks who live, eat, and breathe the education issues every single day, we rely on you for that sort of expertise. So I strongly encourage you to be active with your local members, doing those Hill visits, whether it's Capitol Hill in Harrisburg or Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. And with that, it's just, again, a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you, Congressman Boyle. My name is Tina Valletto. I'm the Director of Community and Government Relations for the Montgomery County Intermediate Unit. And we at the intermediate units throughout the 29 intermediate units throughout the state really do understand the issues and challenges that our districts have, as well as the intermediate units have, to deliver special education services. If throughout the course of this evening, if I don't mention something about the work of the intermediate units, we happen to have the executive director of the Bucks County Intermediate Unit and the assistant, Rebecca. So Mark Hoffman is here. So if I say something wrong, he'll report it to my boss. So just fill me in. I know, text him. But I'll be talking about the work that the IUs do in terms of delivery of service and the challenges we have with the costs associated with that.
All right, before I turn it over to Megan, who's going to be our moderator, just two quick things about the way we're going to run tonight. Number one, there has been a request, since we are recording this in its entirety, and there are some members of the press here covering it as well. For everybody else's privacy, we're asking that individuals are not filming or recording the audio. It will be made available afterward. You also will find pads on each table where you can write down a question. Larry Feinberg over here, my other good friend for 12 years, is going to be collecting them. And Larry, for school board members, is your section leader, so or our section ambassador, right? So you should all know him, and if you don't, make sure you do before you leave tonight. Superintendents also. But Larry will collect them. He'll screen them to make sure that they're on topic, and Megan will proceed to read them out. If you would like a reply and we don't get to your question, make sure that you put your name and contact information with the question, and we will feed it back to your legislative office. Okay, Megan?
Before we get started with some panel discussion, I was hoping that Art could read some remarks from Congresswoman Dean, since she could not be present tonight.
Thank you. So we lost Congressman Boyle, but we picked up Madeline Dean. So yeah, so we're very happy, but we miss you, sir. The contributions you made to Upper Dublin and the area. So unfortunately, Representative Dean was unable to be here tonight. She just gave me a brief statement to read. Statement from Representative Madeline Dean. Maybe she's on CNN. Tonight. She's always on CNN. It's great. Great advocate. Nearly 45 years ago, Congress pledged to provide 40% of the funding required to support special education and related services for children with disabilities. Unfortunately, Congress hasn't followed through on this promise, leaving states and local school districts in the lurch, as we all know. Representative Jared Huffman's bill, H.R. 1878, the IDEA Full Funding Act, will change that, and I'm a proud co-sponsor of that legislation. The bill is about ensuring that every child gets a high-quality education, but it's also about basic decency. States and districts need to be able to rely on the federal government's promises as they make their own difficult budget choices. Educators need to know that their government has their back. And most importantly, special education students and students with disabilities need to feel included and valued because they are.
Thanks to the Congresswoman for giving those remarks. And I just want to recognize a staffer from Congresswoman Scanlon's office as well, some prepared remarks as well.
Good evening. Unfortunately, the Congresswoman couldn't be here today, so she wished I share a message on her behalf. I strongly believe in protecting and increasing investments in public education. One of the most significant things we can do to support our K-12 school is making sure that our education system serves all children, including those with disability, to the highest possible standard. That is why I joined my colleague and a co-sponsor of the IDEA Full Funding Act and the Keep Our Pact Act. This lack of funding puts a huge burden on states and local school districts, who are forced to pay more than their share to make up for the federal government's lack of support. Both bills would mandate gradual increases in IDEA funding so that the full 40% level is reached by 2029 and upheld each year after. By fully funding the Individual with Disability Act education, American schools will be able to give children with disabilities access to high-quality education that they so rightly deserve. A message from Congresswoman Mary Gay Scanlon. Thank you.
Thank you. So I just kind of want to ease into the panel tonight and discuss the background of IDA funding. Where did the Full Funding Act idea come from? Why did the two congressmen decide to sign on as one of the 12 original co-sponsors? If you guys just want to give a little background, what motivated you, what is some of the concepts around the act?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the history of this, it was a bill passed in 1975. It was a commitment by the federal government to provide, I believe, 40% per every pupil for educational and related expenses. It was a commitment that was made by the U.S. government that, quite frankly, has not been kept by the U.S. government, and that's what this bill is about, is to keep that promise. You know, Brendan and I have a lot in common, and I think one of the beliefs that we have is making sure that we have that baseline safety net for members of our community that need our help. And beyond the humanitarian aspect, beyond the right thing to do perspective, it's a financial investment in our economy to provide education for those that have a lot of potential to contribute to our society and to our economy in a lot of ways that a lot of people don't realize. And that's really what it is. It's about basic human decency to invest in the children that need us to invest in them, to give them the opportunity so that they can give back to us.
I agree with everything Brian just said, so rather than repeat it, I'll just add a few parts of it. First, and it's amazing how many people aren't really aware of this, but prior to 1965, now this specific act came in 75, but prior to 1965, there was very little involvement from the federal government at all in education. As folks here know, education has always been in the purview of state and local governments. But 65 was the first time that you had any sort of assistance from Washington, D.C., and it was one of the more controversial aspects of the Great Society. Then fast forward about a decade, or not even a decade, ultimately culminated, as I understand, 1975. But even before that, from the late 60s on, the move was, well, wait a minute, what about those with intellectual disabilities? That term wouldn't have been used then, but essentially this was a group of folks that we were talking about. And I'm glad, Brian emphasized a part of this that is often overlooked. Yes, we're doing it for humanitarian reasons and certain justice reasons, but also it really is an investment. My own wife has told me, and she isn't a special ed teacher, but right there in early education, dealing with kids who end up being identified as somewhere on the spectrum, not to confuse that with those who are deemed to have intellectual disabilities, but there's a lot of overlap where suddenly you have a child who is entering a school for the first time and needs to get extra services, needs to get extra help. It's remarkable to see at the end of the year the progress that is made with those sort of interventions and that sort of assistance versus how the youngster comes in late August or early September. So this is an absolute investment, and I think for us to stress that aspect of it is an important component. Finally, why I was an original co-sponsor is I just think that it's the right thing to do, number one. And number two, the amount of money that we're talking about to get up to approximately $43 billion, we have a multi-trillion-dollar federal budget. So in the grand scheme of things, the amount of money that we're talking about as part of H.R. 1878 is a relatively minuscule part of our overall budget.
I just wanted to remind the attendees that if you do have a question when you're done, if you could just raise your comment card and Larry can grab it from you. Of course, of course.
So I just wanted to state that when IDEA was enacted, that was a federal mandate. So there were requirements that were imposed on the school districts without this. There was a promise for up to 40% of payment for those services that were required by law, but there was nothing to enforce that. And so that's what we've been living with since it was enacted. And each year we have had this discussion down in DC about IDEA reauthorization. There has not been a fresh look from scratch as to what the issues are with the law as it is today. There's been a lot of legal decisions that drive much of what the districts have to do and what the IUs have to do in terms of services for students with disabilities. But that's all on the legal side. There has not been a reauthorization. So along with funding, keeping that promise of keeping the funding up, there's also that question of when are we going to have that fresh look, new lens under today's, think about the technology that was available then when it was mandated versus the technology that's available now. So there are a lot of other issues with IDEA, but we certainly appreciate this commitment to try to get the funding level to the point that there was that promise.
Tina, I promised I wasn't going to put you on the spot, but this kind of feeds into your statement. So taking a fresh look at IDEA, what costs and services should be contemplated with IDEA going forward?
Well, to the extent that we have costs and services for our students with disabilities, the reality is that we are looking at a vast spectrum of services. And our schools are really imposed. There is this requirement to provide the least restrictive environment for those students. And we work very hard to develop the IEPs. But there needs to be a look at all the Supreme Court findings as to what is absolutely required, what has been chipped away in terms of legislation. I'm a former school board member for 8 years, and I know that some of our cases with due process, the legal costs associated with it, those are things that need to be looked at in terms of legislation. But the intermediate units deal with students that have a very low incidence rate, that the school districts can't provide those levels of service because of the students with disabilities that are so profound. Yes, we do have a range of services that we provide, but if you look at our intermediate units and the types of students that we service, and we may be serving them in your school buildings with IU classrooms, but that's a group of students who have different varying needs and services to be provided to them, but maybe there's only one student with that disability in one school district, so we pool it together so that they can create a classroom with students of a similar need. And we do try to provide it with the least restrictive, in the least restrictive environment. And I don't think people really understand the breadth of the services that are provided for students through the intermediate units and the levels of disabilities. We have specialized services for students with low incidence disabilities. We have multi-disabled support. So there are a growing number of disability issues that need to be addressed, and it's multi-pronged. There are different levels of services that have to be provided for each of these students. We have at the Montgomery County Intermediate Unit, we provide deaf, blind support in our region. I know that there is vision, hearing impairment. We are talking about students who might not be able to navigate in the regular classroom without assistive technology that we've been able to serve them with. Autistic services. Every school district may have autistic support, but the IU will provide multi-levels of support for those students with autism. We run intensive emotional support classrooms. That's a big behavioral issues now. Mental health component is a huge discussion point. At Montgomery County Intermediate Unit, we run a partial hospitalization program. Half the day is funded through medical assistance, which we hope doesn't go away. That's another hint, because we talked about that last year when there was a threat of that being removed. But then we also have the other half of the day, we have to provide the education, and IDEA funding, if it were increased, would help support us. We have the transition services. These are things that are required to be provided in an individual education plan. However, if the money doesn't come from the federal government, then the reliance is on the local districts. And the intermediate units work at the behest of the school districts. So our fees and services get transferred. We have to bill our school districts for the services we provide. And in turn, the districts are trying to figure out how to meet their budgets. So looking at IDEA in general and all the breadth and scope of disabilities that are out there truly does make a difference. But our understanding is we need some help to convince the congressman's colleagues down in DC that it is an important endeavor and needs to be looked at.
Thanks, Tina. We have a question from the audience, and it jumps off of what you were getting at about the multi-pronged approach to taking care of special education students. They ask, each year the number of students identified as qualifying for additional services continues to increase. Please speak to how the bill will address this issue. Sidebar.
Sorry.
Iced tea for a tie.
Yeah, we were doing a negotiation here, and Wawa iced tea is very important to Brian. No, I'm sorry, if you could repeat the question.
Each year, the number of students identified as qualifying for additional services continues to increase.
Right.
Can you talk about how the bill will address this issue?
So I think that in many ways, some of you in the audience could speak to this better than we could in this respect. There's a bit of a chicken and egg issue, right? Are there more kids today who have special needs, or is it more kids are being identified as having special needs, or qualifying as some label that would qualify under those with Disabilities Act? I don't know the answer to that question. I would imagine some of you have some real insights into that. I think that is a moving target. 1878 is more about getting the funding part right than anything else. So that's always been my perspective, and having a conversation with Jared Huffman, who is the main sponsor of this, and as I believe has a couple school boards in his district that have been especially burdened by the costs. Really, the focus has been on the financial aspect of it. I don't know if you have something to add to it.
Yeah, no, and that's something that we were looking to glean from you all tonight, is that assessment. Oftentimes the analogous situation when we talk about the mental health crisis that we're facing in our country, same question arises. Is it just being identified and diagnosed more now than it was before, or is it more prevalent? And it might be a combination of both of them. I'll just touch the mental health piece for a second. We all know that it's, taking this outside of the special needs arena. It is harder being a kid now than it ever has been. With all the pressures placed on kids, depression rates, anxiety rates are much higher, I believe, than they have been before, which is why I think it's so important to get, just like we have school nurses, increasingly present in schools, to have mental health counselors, psychologists, and social workers in schools to deal with the depression and anxiety rates that may be exacerbated by the this constant onslaught of social media and bullying and the like. Is it greater? Is mental health issues greater now than it has been before, or is it more identified? I don't know. And to Brendan's point, special needs, autism. You know, a lot of times people with different disorders may have been misdiagnosed in the past that we didn't really accurately treat. Where we're better at treating that now, but that's really, again, I mean, one of the reasons why Brendan and I wanted to come tonight was to get your perspective on that. Do you think that it's more prevalent now, or do you think that it's just being more accurately diagnosed now?
I might add a thought to that. I'm not sure it's necessarily a binary way of thinking about it. I think if we think about a lot of how education used to happen, there was a true under-identification back in the day, you know, all back in the day, right? And we can all think about folks in all kinds of walks of life, my age and older, who probably would have caught a diagnosis today. I can think of some hyperactive superintendents who can't pay attention to anything. Right, board members? So I do think that the beautiful thing about HR 1878 is the focus on the funding, and from, you know, people who are living it locally. I'm not sure that it's really important. Are we over, you know, are we finding more things wrong? That's not really the crux of the problem. The crux of the problem is, as you said, our kids are suffering, and public education is the best hope for those kids across the nation. With 95% of the kids being educated in public schools, we're their last best hope. And so this is huge and really helpful for us, and it offers us practitioners some hope that, you know, Washington's actually paying attention to something important. You know, so I want to really encourage the folks in the room to apply that pressure to the legislators who aren't sitting here. We've got their support, but you know, let's really think about that. And you know, to your point, what we're seeing, and we've talked about this with our special education directors, the surge in mental health issues, which are devastating to kids, to families, to local economies, is huge. And if with some support, we could really make a big difference with that. So.
I just wanted to say that, you know, for those of you who aren't aware, the 40%, right now we're funding from the federal side around 14%. I've heard some numbers. I know Mark DeRocco, you're back there. We were in DC in July, and we heard a presentation that we're down to 12%. Mark is the executive director of the Superintendents Association. So it could be from federal support for a school district, it could be anywhere at 12%, 14%, maybe a little more depending on the school district and the number of needs. But the question then becomes, where does the remainder come from? And that's why this legislation is so important, because the remaining percentage has to be made up. There's a small portion that may come from the state and subsidy, but the bulk of the mandated services have to be provided by the local school district, which in turn means relying on the school property taxes and any other taxes to support the local revenue of each school district. So when people wonder why they're paying so much in school property real estate tax, part of that is because there are mandates from the federal government to require these services that may be very costly, and yet we've got 12 to 14% support from the federal government, and the remainder comes from your local resources. And that's where the problem is, and that's why the more support we can get through funding up to 40% would make a significant difference to allow for school districts to actually have resources to provide for the full gamut of the education needs of all students, not just students with special needs.
Tina, do you know if this is a historical low for the funding promise?
Yes.
And do you know when it started trending downward?
Oh, it's been trending downward for a while. Was it during the downturn when the caps were put in place and we started seeing a true reduction on non-defense spending? That's really when we saw the downward trend.
Kind of jumping back to our earlier discussion about how mental health bleeds into identifying special education students and how there's many different variables to identifying a special education student. Are there other agencies that could potentially relieve this funding deficit because it could be addressed in another manner? Anybody? Or if you just kind of want to spitball a little bit and see if there's a discussion.
In terms of other agencies, everybody is strained. I mean, if we're looking at the needs from providing medical resources, support, OT, PT, you know, some of those costs, again, you know, they're medical, so we rely on funding through medical access, through Medicaid. But other agencies that can help support that, if they're non-defense from a federal standpoint, I don't know where they're going to get that from. So if you're talking about a governmental agency, I can't think of another governmental agency that's not strained at this point with the caps that are being imposed.
Just a quick aside on what was called sequester, which happened actually well before Brian and I got to Washington, I believe starting in 2011. But we were actually at the end of sequester. That was a 10-year deal, and the budget agreement that was passed this summer now gets us through that time period over the next 2 years. So sequester has actually come to an end, but it did put real strict limitations on non-defense spending and defense spending as well.
So the funds that we're actually getting from IDEA, how will HR 1878 provide oversight to ensure that districts are prioritizing their funds to take care of their most vulnerable students? And does the bill incentivize school districts to direct their funds in such a way?
Working now. So one of the things that I liked about 1878 was it does two things. It provides the funding, but secondarily and more importantly provides the discretion for school districts to best allocate the funds based on the specific needs of that district. Because as we all know, there are no great one-size-fits-all solutions when it comes to education or anything else. It's got to be tailored based on specific needs of school districts and individual schools. And I think that's really important that we provide two things, both the funding, robust funding, adequate funding, but number two, the discretion to leave it in the hands of the people that know their students the best on how to best tailor that education.
That would be a huge change for us, because right now the money comes from the federal government to the district through the state. And we don't really have a say in how much we get. We get what the state determines we should be getting. So, you know, that's good news to hear. Do you already have a mechanism that you're thinking about in order to achieve that?
Mechanism as far
As how to, are you planning for money to go directly to the school districts or still come through the state with a designation?
So the funds come, actually, the pass-through funds, so it comes to the intermediate units and then they're distributed to the school districts. So for example, in the 2019-2020 school age allocation in Montgomery County, it was $23,636,000. Bucks County, 17,812,000, and then that gets redistributed to the school districts. So they are pass-through funds.
Tina, a question for you. You had mentioned the need to look at legislation regarding the cost of schools and their due process. There has been discussion of eliminating the option of due process for families. Is there something that you support?
Well, as an attorney, I never want to deprive anyone of their ability to question, challenge, and fight for what they believe their child needs. So I wouldn't say do away with those rights, but I would say that currently under the current mode, if a finding in a due process hearing on even one finding, and Dave, you can probably talk about this more, but just one finding, the school district has to pay the attorney's fees for the family's attorney, and so it's a full out just pay. So unfortunately, in many instances, we do have attorneys who really do seek out these cases so that they can succeed on one item, and they get their full fees paid for by the school district, and that goes into the cost of providing services to a student with disabilities. That's a big part of it. None of us are immune at this point, and so that's the piece, and I believe that's something that needs to be looked at, because when you're looking at the cost of educating a student with disabilities, you have to look at it in totality, and that may include the due process costs. And there are instances of students, families that have gone over and over up through the chain, and it can be a very costly endeavor.
So we've talked a lot about funding. Will there be language changes other than changes to funding in the Full Funding Act? And could you speak to some of the language changes that would potentially be in the bill?
Keep in mind that as we sit here, that's impossible to answer with any piece of legislation, because like right now, for instance, this bill sits in front of the Education and Labor Committee. I'm on Ways and Means. Brian is on Foreign Affairs. Unfortunately, for these purposes, neither of us sit on Ed and Labor. But then even as it would go to the full House, there's an amendment process, not to mention the real problem in Washington, D.C., the Senate. That's always consistently my position, by the way, as a former state House member and U.S. House member. The Senate is always the problem. So anyway, as anyone sits here with any piece of legislation, there inevitably would be tweaks and changes. It's pretty rare to see a bill fly through without that. The other thing I would add is, you hear the list of co-sponsors, and out of 435 House members, it's obviously, we're part of a relatively small list. That doesn't necessarily mean that 400 and some members of Congress oppose this legislation. What you're dealing and going up against, and we're going up against this, is inertia, number one, and number two, a lot of competition. The fact that this has the number 1878 means it's the 1,878th resolution introduced at the time this was introduced. Since then, we have a few thousand, not to mention bills that are well over 5,000. And, of that, a pretty small percentage get acted upon. So really, I would say, I would recommend worrying less about what tweaks may happen down the line and more focus on getting action on this and getting it on the list, because I really do believe as we look for bipartisan opportunities for wins, this is the sort of legislation that could be on that list.
Yeah, I just want to second what Brendan said. 435 members of the House currently, I believe, unless it's changed in the past 24 hours, 113 co-sponsors of this bill. To Brendan's point, does not mean that the rest are not interested or not supportive. It probably means that for many of them, it just hasn't been brought to the top of their priority list. This is where we all come in, myself, Brendan, and you all. The good news here, there was a rules change made to the House rules package this year. One of the reasons why I was, I think, the first Republican in close to 30 years to vote for a Democrat rules package on the first day of Congress was because this is a rules change that we advocated for vociferously. And that is something called the 290 rule, that if you get 290 co-sponsors on a bill, it puts it on something called the consensus calendar, means it will force a floor vote within a reasonable period of time. So that now puts the power in each and one of you through us, that if we can garner 290 co-sponsors, that will force this bill to go on the floor. And good luck to anybody voting against special needs kids. They won't do it. It will pass the House. We will put the pressure on the Senate. But that's an important number. So keep that in mind as you're advocating on the Hill. When you're coming down, use Brendan and I as resources to identify members who are not yet on the bill. And we will work the floor. We'll work our colleagues to get it to that threshold. That's really a huge rules change this year that was made because it puts the power in the hands of the advocates to put pressure on colleagues of ours to co-sponsor this bill and then force a floor vote.
That makes me think of something important, and as you talk about advocates, and you're our advocate, I like to talk about the 3 A's. Okay, there's the average cost of special education per pupil, or the average per pupil expenditure. We talk about the appropriate treatment, and that determines the cost. And then we talk about the actual cost of treating a student. So we may have most of our students in the lowest end of need and service, but then we have a district, even our own district, and we can't talk about individual cases, but they're catastrophic in nature and costly that throw average way out of balance. So how is this bill looking at average cost, determining appropriate cost, and managing the actual cost? I can elaborate if you're... Yeah, please. All right, so again, it's the same way we complain about the charter schools. Yep. Okay, we don't pay charter schools their actual cost of special education. Yep. We pay them the average that we spend per student. Yep. And if they cherry pick and they bring in students that their disability might be a speech impediment, it's very low cost. They'll never take a catastrophic student, and yet they get probably about $30,000 a student for students that only have a $5,000 need. So that's the difference between paying a school district the average per pupil expenditure versus the actual cost of care. And then we have in between another federal mandate, which is the FAPE, free and appropriate public education. So who becomes the determination that you're telling us we're going to get to do that, and that's terrific. Mm-hmm. But how will this bill make that happen?
Yeah, so just to be clear, 1878, what it does is it reconstitutes the original promise that was made in 1975 to pay at a bare minimum 40% of the costs of pupils, 40% per pupil of special educational needs. Now, that's the authorization. This isn't so in Congress, you authorize expenditures and then you have to go and appropriate them. This is the authorization piece. So as Brendan said earlier, it's now in committee. It's going to evolve significantly. It's going to go through the amendments process, and it's going to go to the Rules Committee. Then it will be brought to the floor of the House. We'll vote for it on the floor of the House. Hopefully the Senate will then take it up if they're doing their job, which is a rarity these days. But if they do their job and they take up their own bill, then we go to something called conference, and the differences will be ironed out, and then it'll be brought to the House and the Senate again. So it's going to evolve continuously. But the bill as it currently stands, to our understanding, is that it just reconstitutes that 40% threshold that was the original intent of the 1975 law.
So I'm going to field a question because there's a category of questions that I think I could answer, and then maybe you guys could elaborate on. There's a lot of questions concerning what can we do as public school special education advocates do. And PSBA is actually going to host a Hill Day on September 9th. It's a Monday. Unfortunately, you guys will be traveling back to DC that day, so we'll be meeting with staff, but it's open to all PSBA All Access members. We'll be visiting the entire PA delegation Monday, September 9th. There'll be an email to follow with more information, but one thing that I will say is coming down, meeting with your legislators face to face, they want to hear your stories. They want to see why this funding for special education is needed. They want to hear your personal story. So as somebody who sits and facilitates these meetings, because I'm not in the classroom, I'm not a school administrator, I see that you guys seem to lock into that information when it's personal. So beyond coming and advocating face to face, what other suggestions do you have for helping to get HR 1878 going?
I will answer that question. You want to identify the people that are not co-sponsors on the bill, find constituents, use your social media network, find constituents that live in their districts to go to their offices and put the pressure on them. Because generally speaking, I mean, at least I know this is the rule with most House members in DC, that if there's a meeting request in Washington and there are constituents a part of that group, then generally speaking, the member will meet with them. So find constituents within that group to meet with the members in DC of people who are not co-sponsors, and call them out in that meeting and ask them on the spot, can we count on you to co-sponsor this bill? And if they say they need time, ask them how much time. And if you need a follow-up, say how much time do you need us to follow up, and who in your staff should we follow up with? Hold their feet to the fire, because this is really important, because one of the reasons why we fought for this rules change to get to 290 co-sponsors, it literally puts the power in your hands. If you can get to 290, you're going to get a floor vote. So every single member on the House floor will have to vote yea or nay and go back home and answer to their constituents as to how they voted. It's a tremendous rules change. It puts the power in your hands, along with people that can assist, like myself and Brendan, to work our colleagues, but that's really the key, is to do that.
That really is the key, and nobody else can do it except for us. We're elected officials the same as they are. And the worst thing that happens is when our government relations staff goes in to see a legislator at the state or the federal level. And they say, we want you to do this and we need this, and our school boards are calling for it. The worst thing that happens is when that legislator says to them, well, nobody from my district has called me. So, only our school board members can do that, and Megan will sign you up before you leave tonight.
Well, let me just wanted to add something real quick, and then I know Tina also wanted to mention something as well. First, I congratulate you. You're obviously doing your job, because there are more co-sponsors on this bill from Pennsylvania, and specifically our region, than any other region in any other state in the country. So it's a credit to all of you. Brian is exactly right about the importance of identifying supporters who live in the districts of those who aren't co-sponsors in the bill. If you want to know who's a sponsor and who's not co-sponsor first, I imagine the association could get you that information. But second, literally as you sit there with your iPhone, all of this information's online. You can simply, back 20, 25 years ago, Congress might not have been as transparent. Now it's actually in many ways quite the exact opposite. You can very easily go on. I use the same website that the public accesses, type in the resolution number, brings it up. You can see history, the date it was introduced. You can see who the co-sponsors are. So literally within a minute, you can find this information and then just map it up with where you have members. There, he did in well under a minute was able to find it. So I encourage you to do that. There is, despite the cynicism that people inherently have about government, and especially these days, actually hearing from one constituent, literally one phone call, someone cares about an issue and calls about House Bill 123, that gets paid attention to. and it's more effective. If you can visit in person, great. From the more personal to the least personal is the way I would categorize the effectiveness. So stopping by one of the district offices, showing up in the Capitol, if not that, making a phone call, if not that, a personal email, and then, the less personal it goes, the less effective it is. All right.
If you want to know how it's done, talk to our Pennsbury school teachers right here. They were in our office just this week, and they advocate in a way where it's impossible for me to say no. So just take lessons from them, all right?
I love it. I just wanted to say, going to the offices, speaking to staffers. If it's a travel day and you can't meet with the congressman, then the staffers are just as important to share the messaging with. Because we're in the Southeast and we do have a lot of members that are supportive of it, the reality is that people who live in other parts of the Commonwealth, but also people who live across the country. So some of those members may be in an area where you have a family member that lives. And so call them, let them know, share that information. Social media is a very powerful thing, a messaging piece, and spread the word. So if you know of a legislator who did not sign on to it, contact somebody that lives in that district, because it really does make a difference. We were able to fight the cuts to Medicaid by stressing the fact that medical access billing is so important to our children with special needs. And it was the voices of people across the nation that really did come together and make a difference. So I can't stress it more, and they are very welcoming. Some of them even, I've been in your office, I've been in Brian's office, so I know. Very welcome.
Just a few more questions. So they're asking, what is different about this bill that was different than the 1975 version? What makes you think the federal government's going to comply with the language in the Full Funding Act versus the original bill? Does that make sense?
I don't believe the original bill had the appropriations spelled out the way this does. There was a promise, a discussion of it, but it wasn't actually put into the legislation for IDEA. And so that was the intent. But this actually, 1878 actually spells out how to get the increases done on a annual basis, and by 2028 we'd be up to the 40% funding, and that's the difference.
One of the changes that I did notice is that it does attach the increases to the Consumer Price Index, which is very important, because without that, it's a de facto decrease with every year that inflationary prices go up. So as long as it tracks inflation, there's no real de facto decreases in the value of the funding.
Another question, without oversight of spending, how can the schools be held accountable for following the current laws in place to support special education students so that the number of due process cases decrease?
I'm not, 1878 I think is agnostic on, except for the part that Brian mentioned, is really more agnostic on this point. From what I've seen, and again, all of you in the room would have had more experience with this than I, and even teachers in the classroom would have more experience in this, but it does seem as if our enforcement mechanism today on any of the cases that have to do with, say, parents perceiving they're not getting what they should be in terms of an IEP or some sort of service that they feel that they are entitled to and not getting, it does seem as if our courts are the ways and is really the way in which these individual cases are being adjudicated.
So along that same lines, Pennsylvania monetizes compensatory damages. Will this act offer any control or limit for fashioning a remedy?
No, that would be, I mean, that would be determined at the state level. So for a federal piece of legislation, again, we wouldn't weigh into that. It's our federalist system that is clearly determined at the state level.
That's it for my pile of questions. So unless somebody else is lagging and wants to ask a last minute question, I'm going to turn it over to Mark for closing remarks here.
Well, actually, the closing remarks you want to hear are from Congressman Fitzpatrick and Congressman Boyle. But before I ask them to do that, I want you to recognize, we do have a census coming up next year, but we're probably around 330 million people in the United States. There's only 453 congressmen. Excuse me. Still, you guys don't get to spread around that much. So the enormity of having two of them here in person, two of them represented by staff or by letter, and honestly, Congressman Houlihan's district director was on her way here when the deluge opened up out in Westchester, and I got a text from her. She said, "I'm not going to get there." So the fact that we have 5 of 6 Pennsylvania congressmen, 1/3 of our congressional delegation behind this bill, and 5 of them with us here, it's just astounding. And I can't tell you guys how much I appreciate that. Your staffs, where Congressman Fitzpatrick's staff says, "Yeah, we'll find a date, we'll get him there." It was even better when I reached out to Congressman Boyle's staff. They said, "Oh no, he can't be there, but we'll find a way." And he did. He walked into the last minute. I want you to know he was in Washington 3 hours ago or 4 hours ago, and got on a train, got up here, and it was choreographed. So he walked up the steps just as we needed him to be here. So, and as far as Megan and us being there in Washington when they're not in their offices, I get some of my best advocacy done when they're not giving them 50 things to do in one day. So when they're not being distracted by their bosses, we can get a lot done. So, gentlemen.
Thanks, Mark. I just want to say on behalf of our entire region, Brendan and I are here tonight, but Susan, Mary Gay, Chrissy, Madeline, Dwight, we're all good friends and good partners, and we're all solidly behind this cause. So I want you to know that, even though the ones that couldn't be there, they do care about this issue, and I know that, and I can personally testify to that. Back before I was before I was in Congress, I was an FBI agent back when I used to be cool, and when I used to go to schools, because that was a big part of our job. We would go into elementary schools and talk to kids and talk to them about the dangers of drugs and addiction and bullying and so on and so forth. And I would always tell them that, being in law enforcement, federal law enforcement, is a really important job. We're responsible for keeping you all safe. But there's only one job that I can think of that's more important than ours, and that's of being a school teacher and an educator. And I made that point every single time, every single classroom that I was in, to let those kids know that they need to look up to you all and respect you for the work that you do, because outside of being a parent, being a school teacher is the most important responsibility we can have. You are entrusted with the time and the attention of our youth, and you're going to have so much of an impact on the direction that their lives head. And the least that we can do from a governmental standpoint is provide you with the legislative support, the authorization, and the funding that you need to do your jobs. So I just wanted to take the time to thank you for what you guys do. I really, really do appreciate you. I know Brendan does as well. We all do, because it's not easy. You do not have an easy job. It's very exhausting, but it's very, very rewarding, and it's incredibly important. And you all have made a decision to dedicate your lives serving a cause bigger than yourselves, and that's the youth of our country, which are our future. So I just want to thank you for that.
Oh, very well said, and it reminds me that when a couple years ago, when a friend who's out in the center part of the state, more Dauphin County area, told me that he was going to run for school board, my exact reaction was, "Are you crazy?" I said, "That is so much work and so much grief to get yelled at, and for no money." I said to him, and I will repeat it to you, that is true public service. So thank you to all of you who serve on school boards. You don't have to worry about me ever running against you. Congress is enough to handle. Second point I would make is that I mentioned this before, but as the husband of an elementary school teacher, I for all of you who are teachers, many of you who are on the school board probably were teachers at one point, or may have been, or those of you who are here and not on a school board and still in the classroom, thank you for what you do. And those of you who are in administration as well, who are involved in making education work. I know just how hard a job it is and how many hours. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you. And finally, I'll say, I'll make a prediction. While we're all here talking about this important issue, on cable news, whether it's MSNBC or Fox News or CNN, I sincerely doubt any of them are talking about 1878 tonight. And there's almost an exactly inverse proportional relationship between the amount of time that we spend substantially on policy issues and then what ends up getting covered. We spend probably 98, 99% of our time doing things like this and working on very in-the-weeds issues that don't get a lot of attention, and then 1 or 2% on other issues, but it's that 1 or 2% that tends to get 98 or 99% of the attention. And that's really unfortunate because it gives a misleading picture to the public. I think that folks in Bucks County, Montgomery County, Philadelphia would all feel a little bit better tonight about public service if they saw all of you here and all of us discussing this important issue, which I am optimistic that we will, with everyone's help, be able to get done. So thank you.
Nathan, John, where is John? Nathan, did you have anything?
Well, just thank you all for coming out tonight. We really appreciate it. Again, join me in thanking both the congressman and our other panelists for being here. I have a feeling Larry has a plan.
I just had a comment, which is Representative Wild is on the Education and Labor Committee, and I have reached out to school board members, powerful school board members that are in her district, and thus far, for some reason, she's been hesitant to sign on. So when you're walking through the halls and you bump into her, tell her we asked about it.
September 9th, if you have a chance, we'd love to have you in D.C. with us for the day. I think we're going to have a great day storming the halls. We were just down a small team of people last month and visited every member of Congress representing Pennsylvania, so we'd love to have you join us for the day. Again, thank you very much. I know it's a late day for many of you to come out, but as both congressmen pointed out, our school board directors in Pennsylvania are just amazing with the number of hours that they give to education. This is another example of them taking the time to come out and learn more and understand how they can impact and really make a difference in their schools. So thank you everybody for being here tonight. Thank you to our panelists.
And please let Megan know how this event worked tonight. They're going to try to do 2 a year, so this was the first.